Hello everyone, welcome back.
Today's story is from r/malicious.compliance. Story 1. About a decade ago, I worked for a big-name company, electrostatic powder coating semi-wheels. The GM, who was actually a really good boss, got a trainer to come in and teach me what I was doing right and wrong. After a week, we got things narrowed down with the settings on the machines, and my quality improved a lot. My quantity of wheels I could paint in a day improved by about 5 to 10 per day. I was now averaging anywhere from 50 to 65 wheels a day. I used those same settings for almost a year before that same GM started messing with them. I had a few wheels from a trash company come to me covered in dried mud one day. Not the first time, and it wasn't going to be the last. I had knocked off as much as I could before stripping them, and did my best to blow off what dust was left. I still missed some spots on the edges. Usually, when this happens, I end up with tiny holes on the edges of the rims. That day, the GM had come back to get a count of paint, to see what needed to be ordered. GM, what's with all the holes on the edges of these wheels? Me, it's from dirt. I didn't get it all off when I blew off the wheels. GM, dirt doesn't cause this, I think your settings are the issue. Me, I'm telling you, it's dirt. Every time we get these customers' wheels in with dried mud all over them, this is what happens. GM, dirt doesn't cause this. I'll have some people come in to check this out. He left after that. Fast forward to next week, and he meets me in the morning with about 4 other people. GM, these guys are going to look over the machines and adjust things so we no longer have issues. Me, I told you it was dirt. GM, the professionals are going to adjust the settings, and you will leave them where they are at. If you don't, you will get written up. This is not up for discussion. Okay? Message heard loud and clear. I'll leave it to the professionals and not touch a thing. Thankfully, my powder gun had multiple settings. I asked the professional to set his new settings on another preset. The next day, I noticed the wheels I painted were coming out yellow. I also noticed that the paint was very thin in certain spots. Due to my new settings, the positive charge was blasting powdered paint away from the wheels. A few days go by, GM comes back and sees all my newly painted white wheels yellow, and asks, why is everything coming out yellow? I told him it was because the oven was set too high. GM, why didn't you change it? That's over 100 wheels that need to be redone. Me, I was told not to change the settings the professional set, so I didn't touch it. He walked over, and turned it down, and told me to leave it. A week later, I get called into the office. One of our biggest customers was complaining that their wheels needed to be removed and repainted after a week or two, due to starting to rust. We delivered over 150 wheels a week to them. GM, what is going on here? The paint is too thin, and the customer is complaining. Do I need to call the professionals back in to look things over? Me, it wouldn't change much, because I haven't touched anything on the machines since they were out last time. GM, just fix it. I don't care what you do, just fix it. He never questioned me again when it came to powdered coating. Story 2. The other day, I was at my local pools. I looked over all the open lanes, searching for an uncrowned lane to do some laps. Out of the available lanes, one had 3 people, and another had just 1. Like any reasonable person, I hopped into the lane with only a single other person and began to do my laps. On my first lap, I overtook the other person and was told, quite aggressively, that the fast lane is over there, pointing to the lane with 3 people in it. I'm usually a fast swimmer, but the lap I did was average, if not slow. Before I continue, I should mention that, literally, every other slow person that I've swum with had been completely okay with me swimming fast. Where I swim, there is also an unofficial custom that, when 2 people are in a lane, you swim side by side instead of the usual clockwise circle. This person was not okay with me swimming quickly, was very rude in telling me to move to a more crowded lane, and was, in fact, a very slow swimmer. Well, I thought to myself, I'm definitely not moving to a more crowded lane. I guess I should start swimming slower to appease her. I guess, since my shoulder really hurts from my competition the other day, and I definitely don't want to injure it more, I should do some relaxing kicking. And that's exactly what I did. I did kick. Now, my kick is definitely not fast, but I purposely did it even slower, because obviously, this is the slow lane. My kick was so slow, the person started overtaking me. I made sure that they suffered. I would start when they were very close to the wall, to force them to slow down, and I would swim in such a way that they didn't have enough space to overtake me. The best thing happened about 10 minutes after I started my malicious compliance. 2 other old-timers jumped into our lane. Now, I started swimming in such a way that I would be next to the old-timers in a way that suggested that I was overtaking them, but I never seemed to be quite fast enough to actually overtake them. How unfortunate. This formed a wall, and I would occasionally look back to see the person stopping every few seconds to not run into anyone, looking annoyed every time they had to do so. Eventually, they got so fed up that they hopped out, and, as soon as they did so, I started swimming at my normal pace again, making sure that every time I finished a lap, I would make eye contact to further annoy them. The old-timers weren't upset that I was swimming faster. In fact, no one who jumped into that lane was. I hope that person learns their lesson and never tries to tell anyone that they are swimming too fast aggressively ever again. I would like to point out that I have no issue moving to another lane or sticking to one side of my lane. However, I definitely have an issue with aggression. Next story. I've joined a new, extremely disorganized team. My manager, who plays the game in corporate well, has somehow made it look like the problems are due to the new person, me. Their resolution to their disorganization has been to ask me to copy and paste fields from forms all day, every day, from dates to tracking numbers, and then, will call on me any moment of the day to share a specific data point. I've explained how unreasonable this is. I even suggested we pull reports and automate, but was told that's too complicated and will take too long. They originally did this by hand. I've been told, these are the rules. I've now pulled the reports, automated the job, made some pivot tables, and my 8-hour job is done in 10 minutes. I'm not saying anything. They think I'm slaving away, organizing tracking numbers and dates, scouring a data point for my master when called, while I'm working on my second remote job. I just walk out of my office from time to time with my sad face, while my boss smiles smugly. Next story. This is my father's story, not mine. My father and his friend were doing a course, which required them to adhere to some corporate standards. A little background. Both of them already had well-paying jobs. They were just doing this course for enhancing knowledge and not for any other gain. The course was divided into phases, and this particular one was for 18 days. You were only allowed one leave. And if you took more than that, you had to redo the entire thing. Our city was around 2 hours away from the course center, and they traveled daily to and from to attend it. They mostly tried to be early, but this one day, there was unusually high traffic, and they were much delayed. As a result, they were around 10 to 15 minutes late. When they reached the location at around 10:15, they were informed by the course supervisor, CS, that they would be marked absent for the half day. They both protested, stating their reason for lateness, and also that the class had not even started. That their appeals were dismissed. The irony? The lecturer himself was delayed by traffic, and the class didn't begin until well after 11. They were both frustrated for having a half-day marked absent for no reason. So, at 5 that day, they stood up in the middle of the ongoing lecture, packed their bags, and started leaving the class. The lecturer was confused, and the course supervisor was enraged. He asked them, "What are you doing?" They replied, "Following the protocol. If we are expected to arrive exactly at 10, we should be able to leave at 5 too." Apparently, the course supervisor wasn't prepared for someone to follow their own rules to the letter. The CS began shouting at them that you can't leave before the lecture ends. "I will mark you absent for the full day," etc., but they just left. They got calls from the CS and other persons, threatening to remove them from the course. As I said, my father already had a job, so he wasn't much bothered by the threats, and the same with his friend. They went the next day at exactly 10, ignored the CS and his warnings, and left at 5 that day too. The other students began following their example and left at 5 too, which led to the institute paying extra to the lecturers, as they had to invite them the next day as well to continue the class. There isn't much more to it, as the course was only for 18 days, and they both passed with flying colors. This story came out of nowhere a few days ago, and I couldn't stop myself from posting it here, however small the MC. Next story. A little bit of backstory to help explain some of the later facts. In the military, every piece of equipment gets preventative maintenance done on it to maintain it in good, working condition. In the Navy, we have a very well laid out maintenance system, with step-by-step instructions on how to do every bit of maintenance, instructions so simple
a monkey could do it. Part of these maintenance procedures lists required tools, parts, materials, and test equipment, and they are also extremely specific. Detailing the length requirement of your screwdrivers, the brand of your gauges, etc. The management of this system the Navy uses is called the Maintenance and Material Management System, 3M, or Plan Maintenance System, PMS. As an electrician, we owned all electrical distribution equipment on board, and for jobs without an electrical training background, we also owned the actual equipment. So, the electronics technicians, with electrical training, could maintain their own electrical equipment. But the cooks, culinary specialists, without an electrical background, relied on us to maintain their equipment for them. Now, if you've ever used a commercial flat-top grill/griddle before, you know you set it to a specific temperature you want the cooktop heated to, and not a 0 to 9 dial like your stove at home. Part of maintaining the griddle was checking the calibration of this temperature setting once every year or two. I forget how often this check was, but it wasn't a frequent check. Relatively early on, when I got on board the ship, young EMFN, junior electrician, Feb2025 was assigned to do this maintenance check, so, I gathered all of my tools, parts, materials, etc. In doing so, I couldn't find the proper temperature sensor for our calibrated temperature gauge. We had the round-tip ambient temperature probe for use in the ovens, but not the flat-tip surface temperature probe for use on a griddle. I asked a different supervisor to my favorite supervisor for help, and he couldn't find it either, so we ordered a new one, and he said he'd take care of the paperwork for the maintenance check. Being new and unfamiliar with the system, I let it go and never questioned when the maintenance check disappeared from the maintenance list the next week, meaning someone accomplished it, hint hint, nudge nudge, and all was good. The next time this maintenance check came up due, we were on deployment, and it was again assigned to me. By this time, we had a new supervisor, and I was now EM3, slightly less junior electrician, Feb2025. A bit more knowledgeable. I looked where we kept all our calibrated equipment and couldn't find the flat-top temperature probe I knew it needed, so I asked my supervisor. He found we had one on order, but didn't know that we had one in the shop, and told me to figure it out. Knowing that was an unlawful order and would amount to lying about the check, and could bite me in the ass later, I said I wouldn't do the maintenance without the right equipment. Since he couldn't lawfully order me to, we started putting a note on the check that the tools were on order, and delaying it. This went on for about 2 to 3 months until the check was about to go red, move out of periodicity and cause negative numbers on our maintenance reports, and I was again ordered to figure it out or I'd be written up. I refused and raised the same issue to my boss's boss, and we tore the shop apart trying to find the right equipment, but couldn't find it, so he told me not to worry about it. Later that week, while I was on watch as a roving watchstander, allowed to walk around the ship and even required to, after dinner one evening, I saw a newer, more junior electrician, let's call him MFA Timmy, even more junior than I initially was as an electrician, in the galley, kitchen, working on the griddle. I took a step into the galley and asked him what he was doing, and lo and behold, he was doing the maintenance check. I asked him what temperature probe he was using, and he showed me the one for the oven. I explained to him the issue and told him if he signed the maintenance check, it would be gun decking, lying on official paperwork, and he could get in trouble, but I let him make his own decisions as an adult. He decided to continue doing the check. I giggled and continued on with my watch. After my watch it was nearly 10 p.m. so I went to bed for the night. About an hour later I got woken up being told my supervisor needed me in the galley. I sighed figuring it was about the check and I was going to get that earlier threatened write-up. After getting dressed and making it to the galley, the entire electrical shop was in the galley troubleshooting the griddle. You see, MFA Timmy got to the step in the PMS where it said to use a screwdriver to adjust a dial until the thermometer read the same temperature indicated by the set temperature. When he measured it, it was off by about 150 degrees, so he kept turning up the heat. Eventually, it was hot enough to melt the griddle's built-in over-temp protection device, instantly shutting the stovetop off. Turns out, he did need that temperature probe. I was tasked with helping come up with a solution to fix it because the griddle was a critical piece of equipment for the cooks, and we had no replacement parts to fix it. I asked MFA Timmy if he ever finished the last steps of the maintenance card, turning the grill off, putting it back together, reporting completion of the PMS. He told me he hadn't. I turned to my boss and said, since the maintenance check, I explicitly advised against doing without the proper tools, was still ongoing, and I was informed I could do the maintenance or be written up, I'd stick with my original decision and refuse to do the maintenance. He could write me up in the morning during working hours. But, in the meantime, I was going back to bed. Have a nice night. In the morning, I did indeed get written up, but for the insubordination, not for refusing the maintenance check, while my boss's boss looked on with the biggest shit-eating grin at me for holding my ground, and my supervisor was pissed at me. Turns out, I was right, and we couldn't do that maintenance check without the right equipment. This remains one of my write-ups I am least ashamed to have ever gotten, and I'd take it again in a heartbeat to give a giant I told you so middle finger to idiot middle managers. I later found an electronic record of the counseling chit my supervisor got for tasks people were doing maintenance without the proper equipment, because I laid out that this was a known issue. We didn't have the right probe for years, and I threw his ass deep under the bus. I hated the guy. We got the right probe in about 6 months later. Next story. I once spent quite a long time fixing a computer for a new client. After the PC had crashed, the old hard drive failed completely. Fortunately, The customer had a basic file backup from perhaps a year or two ago, so we got most of the files back. However, I had very little info to go on. I didn't know the original version of Windows, I had no idea what apps they used, or what email client they used. I was met by repeated "I don't know" and it didn't look like that before. I continued to be patient, calm, and understanding, bringing up images on the internet to see if any start menus or apps looked familiar. In the end, I installed the latest and greatest of everything. I got it looking really good, easy to use, and all their apps on the start menu. They started getting pretty moody when we had spent half an hour trying to recover the forgotten email password. Apparently, the security question wasn't something they'd have ever known. The partial recovery phone number wasn't theirs. Until, yes, it was their landline. Then they find the password in their book, even though that's not the one I use for my email. Except it is. Finally, I've invested enough time on this, I've asked all the questions, and squeezed out a few answers. The computer is all good. However, I get several calls over the next couple of days, asking where some obscure apps have gone. Why did I remove them? Why have I not installed the dodgy cleanup utility they paid for? Why have I deleted the email contacts? They meant autofill, which obviously was empty. Where are the browser passwords? I go back and get a lecture on how it's just not good enough. They have been invoiced good money for the computer to be fixed, and frankly, it's not fixed. They just want it back the way it was. TBH, I'd really undercharged for my time anyway, maybe 2 hours instead of the actual 5 to 6 invested, because no matter how hard I tried, it was never going to be a job they were completely happy with. Being younger and less experienced, I'd missed some potential red flags. The customer was slightly outside my usual area, they should have been able to find several technicians closer to them. The first phone call had been out of hours. They had been a bit difficult and uncooperative from the start. They had almost expected the job to not be good enough, and during the small talk, they'd already complained about their plumber, and how many times they've had to find a new cleaner for their home because they have been let down several times. They hadn't yet paid the invoice. Get it back the way it was. The client popped out of the room for a couple of minutes, and I was so fed up by this point. I took the side off of the case, removed the new drive, and reconnected the broken one, still in the case. I picked up my tool bag and met the client in the hallway, all sorted. It's back exactly as it was before. And don't worry, I'll cancel the invoice so there's nothing to pay. I made a dash for it. I have no idea what happened next. I ignored a few missed calls and then blocked the number. I thought about how I'd reply to any kind of email or online review, but I heard no more. I like to think that they got someone far less patient, more expensive, and got a worse result. Next story. Many years ago, when I was 15 years old, I was enrolled in a driver's education course to get my learner's permit. This involved several sessions, riding around with the instructor and 2 other students in the car, taking turns between driving and observing. This Saturday morning, I was first up, and pulling out of the school parking lot, when a dozen small sparrows flew right in front of my windshield. I lightly tapped the brakes, and the instructor ordered me to pull over. He always had you pull over and stop before he reprimanded you. He sternly told me, "We don't stop for birds." I argued that I just lightly tapped the brakes as they flew inches from my windshield, and it was not done in panic. He reiterated, "We do not stop for birds." A half hour later, we are a ways outside of town. A little over 100 miles west of San Antonio, Texas, and I'm still driving. The speed limit in this rural area is 70 miles per hour, which my cruise control is set to, a speed the Geo Metro's 3-cylinder engine is struggling to maintain. We come over the top of a hill, and there's a half-dozen wild turkeys slowly crossing the road up ahead. I keep in mind my instructor's orders not to stop for birds and maintain my course. As we near the birds, I show no sign of slowing down, and the instructor hits his brake on his side of the car quite abruptly and yells at me to pull over. He makes me get completely out of the car and starts to berate me about not slowing down for the turkeys. With a straight face, I say, "Sir, you told me not to stop for birds." He gets a bit flustered, then, he stammers, "You know what I meant," and orders me to switch places with a girl in the back seat. I didn't get to drive any more that day, but this was my only major incident, so I still passed the course and got my permit. Not so funny side story. This girl that replaced me was the worst driver I've still ever ridden with to this day. He should have never passed her and allowed her to get her license. A year after this, when she was pulling into a Sonic, she mixed up the gas and the brake and plowed through the picnic tables, sending a family of 4 to the hospital. That's it for now. See you in the next post.